Hi everyone, we are live again from COP26 here in Glasgow, UK for the United Nations Climate Change Conference. We're going to be joined today by Indigenous Climate Action. Eriel Tchekwie is actually going to be joining us from that group. I think I see her here. I'm just going to try to invite her into this live. Let's see. Hi, Eriel.
Hi, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right. Just trying to find a quiet corner out here in Glasgow at the COP. So yeah.
Yeah, last day of the conference. It's been quite a 2 weeks. So just want to remind our audience, this Q&A is going to be all about Indigenous Climate Action, which is a group that's here at COP26 in Glasgow. Eriel Tchekwie, our guest, is the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action, and she's here to answer all of your questions about that organization, as well as about decolonizing climate policy. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and we'll get to as many as we can throughout this live today. But Eriel, to start, I just wanted to get you to describe some of the work that Indigenous Climate Action does for those who might not be familiar with it.
Yeah, for sure. So Indigenous Climate Action is an Indigenous-led climate justice organization based in so-called Canada. And our work is really centered around empowering and inspiring Indigenous youth and Indigenous peoples to take their roles and responsibilities as climate leaders and become climate champions, not only in this country, but across the globe. And we do that through different types of training, education programs, including our Indigenous Climate Leadership Program, as well as looking at developing our own research, looking at climate policy in the country, and other sort of nature-based solutions and other things that are coming out. We have an Indigenous Youth Leadership Program and a climate justice program as well. So really trying to sort of get across the board and really look at different ways that we can engage our communities to be climate leaders.
And one of your focuses is on decolonizing climate policy. Can you describe what that means?
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, we have a lot of really great work that's being done in the country to sort of look at what our responsibilities are in climate change, but it's often done through a lens that is a colonial lens, looking at solutions within the same structures that essentially have caused the climate crisis. So colonization for many Indigenous peoples was when we saw the first changes on our lands and territories. And for us, climate change began upon colonization. Colonization also brought with it systems of capitalism, extractivism, and systems of white supremacy that devalued Indigenous knowledge and ways of being. And so decolonizing climate policy is looking at the current suites of policies that are being developed in so-called Canada and sort of deconstructing them and putting them through an Indigenous lens, and how we can not just talk about indigenizing, because that's not what we're looking to do, but to decolonize. So deconstruct and pull apart to create room for our own systems and ways of being and knowing, and develop our own policies that are rooted in our relationships with each other and the land.
And I just want to remind our audience, we're taking your questions about decolonizing climate policy. Our guest here, Eriel Tchekwie, is from Indigenous Climate Action. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I want to get to one question that we actually got in advance of this live, because we posted to our stories asking if our audience had any questions. And Wagner on Instagram is asking, what are the Indigenous solutions? So Eriel, I know your organization focuses on empowering Indigenous-led solutions to climate change. So can you speak to what some of those solutions look like?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the first facts to understand when we talk about Indigenous-led solutions is knowing some really, really good facts. There are two that I want to share. One is 80% of the world's biodiversity is within or adjacent to Indigenous lands and territories. That is a really good reference to the fact that Indigenous peoples are the greatest protectors of the biodiversity that's necessary for climate stabilization. Secondarily, Indigenous peoples and land defenders are responsible for safeguarding and keeping 1.8 billion tons of carbon in the ground by resisting extractive carbon industries. That is highlighted in one of our joint reports with IEN, Indigenous Environmental Network, and Oil Change International, called Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon. And so when we look at those two things together, we start to look at what Indigenous-led solutions are. And those come from our communities. They're rooted in our cultures, our identities, our ways of being and knowing. And that can look like, it sounds very simple, but it can look as simple as cultural and language revitalization. There have been studies that have shown that when a language is intact and the culture is intact in the communities, the biodiversity of that region flourishes. Along with it, so does the quality of life for women and girls and all people in the community, as well as localized economies. All of that actually equals to better biodiversity for carbon sequestration, less importation of outside food sources, so decreases our carbon footprint, and increases to the quality of life, and developing regional solutions to help reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and other destructive industries. Secondarily to that, other Indigenous-led solutions are the assertion of our sovereignty and self-determination and control over our lands and territories through direct action, forms of civil disobedience, as well as the assertion through legal systems to demand that we have full control and autonomy of our lands and territories. Again, leading to all of those other things. I think we couple that and marry that with other Western technologies like solar, wind, and other things to try to find ways to equalize and come to a place of more stability, both energy sovereignty, but also sovereignty over ourselves. And that's climate justice, not just addressing the emissions in the atmosphere.
And I want to get to some of the questions we're getting live here. I see a question from Anna. She's asking, how can allies support decolonization at the local level, such as in Toronto?
I think that's a really good question. You know, decolonization is not just for Indigenous peoples. We all have a role and responsibility in decolonization. And it's a lifelong process. We have to undo those colonial mindsets, things like man's dominion over nature, terra nullius, all of these doctrines of discovery that said that Indigenous peoples were nothing before the colonizers. We have to recognize that our systems and ways of knowing should not have been demonized and devalued. And so part of this is not just for our communities to empower ourselves to believe that, but it's a part of decolonizing the frameworks of our systems that were never created for our success. The fact that Indigenous peoples were not even allowed to vote until 1960, you know, we have been disenfranchised and disempowered from these structures for a very long time. And it's only been in recent history that that has changed. And now we're not asking to just participate, we're asking to decolonize. And that we can't do alone. We need our allies to participate in that movement, know who your Indigenous neighbors are, build those relationships, and work towards actively dismantling those systems of white supremacy and oppression that are under the hands of colonial governments.
And another question we're getting live here is from J Bell MC. They're asking, how can we support these solutions, especially the decisions to extract from the land or impose pipelines?
You know, I think part of the solutions piece, it suddenly got loud where I am, so I apologize. Some of the ways in which people can support these solutions is to support Indigenous land defenders when they are on the front lines, but also that demanding that we look at solutions beyond what the government prescribes as valid. So we have to demand more from our governments. We have to demand that Indigenous rights, language, and culture is included and valued as part of those solutions. And that when extractive industries come, that we're demanding that Canada implement systems of free, prior, and informed consent, as opposed to just saying that they need to consult with our nations.
So also on this topic, when we were asking for questions in advance, a few people emailed us to ask at CBC.ca and also responded on Instagram to ask about Fairy Creek. So, you know, one person, Nick on Instagram, said the Fairy Creek blockade and logging in this country, should there be a moratorium on all logging? So I'm wondering if you can speak to Indigenous Climate Action's perspective on that.
You know, I think that the issues around logging are age old in this country, to be honest. You know, Canada's logging and deforestation is some of the worst in the world. And I think that Canada likes to pretend that that's not true, but the reality is it is. There have been some groups that have said that Canada is the fastest deforesting nation in the world, only second to Brazil and the Amazon rainforest. So when we talk about a moratorium on all logging, of course, we use a lot of wood in our homes, but Canada has created a lot of softwood lumber forests in this country. And I think what Berry Creek and other groups are asking for is a moratorium on old growth logging. And I think that that is critical because those are the places that have some of the richest biodiversity in the world. And that's the biodiversity that we need to protect, not just for our cultures as Indigenous peoples, but for future generations and for the ability for our planet to sustain life beyond our generation.
And just a reminder, if you have any questions about decolonizing climate policy and any questions for Eriel from Indigenous Climate Action, please leave them in the comments. I want to get to one question we got from Ricardo on Instagram. He said, Canada's current economy heavily depends on oil and gas production. How do we shift away from that? Can you speak to ICA's perspective on that as well?
Yeah, shifting away from the oil and gas economy, that's a really interesting question because I think the reality is that we're not just talking about shifting from one energy source to another. We can't do that. The reality is the G7 nations, so the big leading sort of Western nations, have developed a sort of status quo of living that is highly energy intensive and wasteful. And we really have to reconcile how we live before we can even start talking about transitioning to new fuel systems, because alternative energy systems also have forms of extractivism with them. So we need to be talking about phasing out of dirty fossil fuels, destructive fossil fuels, but we can't just simply be replacing them with solar and wind farms and so on and so forth. We really need to be taking a hard look at how we can reduce our dependency on energy systems that are wasteful. We need to reform our grid systems. There's so much we need to do. It's not just about phasing out of fossil fuels, but absolutely phasing out of fossil fuels is necessary in order for us to meet our climate targets, to effectively address the climate. But again, it's much more nuanced than just phasing out of fossil fuels.
And a similar question we got from Lego Molding on Instagram. He asked, what does a net zero world look like?
So there's a lot of talk about net zero, and I think it can be really confusing to folks. But within the framework that Canada is delivering to the public, they're looking at sort of offsetting their emissions. That's also confusing. So I know folks, sometimes if you've traveled anywhere, I know many of us haven't. This is my first trip since the pandemic started, but you often get a choice to, offset your flight by planting some trees. And net zero in Canada is relying quite heavily on offsetting their emissions. So trying to find ways to buy their way out of actually not effectively reducing current emissions, but looking at ways to buy credits, carbon credits to offset their activities. So a great example of why net zero proposals in Canada are fraudulent is that the Alberta tar sands, a territory where I come from, so I'm a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, Treaty 8 territory, home to the Alberta tar sands. It is growing. The tar sands represents 26% of the emissions profile for the country, and the industry is still growing. They have more mines and are creating more barrels per day than they ever have in history, even though we're in a climate crisis. And Canada is planning to offset those emissions through conservation or parks and biodiversity, or through carbon trading from other industries that are decreasing their emissions so that other ones can continue to pollute. For me, we don't need net zero, we need real zero. That means effectively phasing out of tar sands and other heavy fossil fuels and coal and other destructive industries, while simultaneously conserving and protecting the biodiversity. That's true zero. Net zero is a fallacy based on false solutions that allow polluters to continue to pollute and buy their way out. And big industries will continue to advance this and create new capitalist markets that actually are going to prey on Indigenous lands and territories. So for us, again, net zero is real reduction in emissions, real conservation, and real climate justice led by people, not by corporations.
And I see a question here from Power Stones Jewelry. They asked, many argue nuclear is part of the solution too. I don't agree myself, but I'm curious where you see nuclear falls in this equation.
That's a really, really good question because, as far as when we talk about the energy sources that are on the planet to continue the status quo of the way in which we consume energy, particularly in developed nations, nuclear is very, very sexy. It has a low emissions profile, but the life cycle of nuclear waste and contamination is exponentially like I don't even know. I think it's probably like 10,000 folds longer and more destructive for the waste and the waste management of nuclear energy, which can have devastating effects on communities and territories. My family's trap line exists within the uranium fields in northern Saskatchewan, and we were forcibly removed from our territory. So I see the huge problem that nuclear poses, not just for the extraction, like many extractive industries, but for the life cycle and dangers that the waste has on the communities and the lands and the territories. I think we should stay away from nuclear as much as we possibly can and be phasing out of nuclear energy where we can as well.
And I see a question from Hannah here, who's asking, how can land back promote land sovereignty and ecological preservation?
Thank you for that question. I really liked it. I saw it in the chat as it was going up. I think it's critical. And a lot of the negotiations here within the UN have really been focused on Indigenous land tenure, or the return of lands and territories that we have safeguarded and protected for hundreds of years to be returned under the power and guidance of our communities. And that is essentially land back. If we are able to have our land back, we are able to decide what happens in those lands and territories, whether it's conservation and protection, whether it's, cultural stewardship, all of those things. And we would actually be able to implement things like free, prior, and informed consent and sovereignty and self-determination. Without our lands back, those are just simply words that are meaningless. So we absolutely need to have control over our lands and territories. And this goes back to some of the treaty making processes in Canada. We were supposed to be managing our lands together, but Canada has created this paternalistic approach where they get to have ultimate say and tell us what we can and can't do. And that's something that needs to end. And it can only end once we have our land back.
And there's also a question from Daniel here on Instagram. He's asking, how do we include all youth in our climate action?
That's also an incredibly important question. The youth are the ones that are inheriting the future of tomorrow. And within these climate discussions, it's a scary future that we're seeing. We're at about 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and we've made commitments to stay 1.5 below. And we don't even know what's going to happen. The catastrophic storms and weather changes that we've already seen are alarming. And so if we don't have youth that are a part of these discussions and plans and negotiations, then how are they supposed to know how to move forward and build those movements? For Indigenous Climate Action, we do that through our youth leadership program, but we are also doing intersectional movement building. So we're focused on working with other Black, Indigenous, people of color movements and our allies to try to create a unified future that respects and upholds and uplifts and affirms the rights of Indigenous peoples, which are unique and affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but the rights of all people. Human rights and Indigenous rights go hand in hand, and we have to understand that youth are an important aspect and voice in moving forward, and we have to do this all together.
And I'm just reminding our audience, we're answering your questions about decolonizing climate policy. I'm here with Eriel Tchekwie from Indigenous Climate Action. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. But Eriel, I also wanted to ask you, today is the last day of COP26. It's the end of this United Nations Climate Change Conference. From your perspective, how do you feel about what's been accomplished or not accomplished, or the promises made, not made so far?
So I think some of the biggest takeaways and things that I would like to share with folks is that we found out that the largest delegation of people at the Conference of the Parties COP26 here in Glasgow were oil and gas lobbyists. That means that they were the loudest and strongest voice within these walls and hallways at these negotiations. So for every oil and gas executive, for every Indigenous person, there was 2 oil and gas lobbyists in attendance here, because Indigenous peoples represented the second largest contingency here. This has meant that a lot of the negotiations are surrounding what I call false solutions, our carbon markets, and that this has become a trade negotiation, looking for ways to create new economies so that big banks and corporations can continue to profit while the lives of those that are most impacted by climate change continue to be sacrificed at the altar. We're not even talking about the fact that the biggest consumer of oil and gas is the military, yet the military is not even discussed in these spaces. I think that we've had to fight very hard over the last 2 weeks for the inclusion of language that respects human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples, but that will mean nothing if it's just for lip service and for show. And so Article 6 is one of the big pieces of negotiation, and that is the negotiation around the creation of a global carbon market mechanism. And that is something that is incredibly dangerous because, again, it's just finding ways to offset, not actually reduce our emissions, and look at our own complicity in our consumption of oil and gas, our consumption of dirty fossil fuels. But we really have to be talking about real zero, and not the false solutions that are being promoted here. We need to uplift real human rights and the rights of Indigenous communities, not just give them lip service. And again, land back, decolonizing climate policy, all of the things we've been talking about are part and parcel to all of that.
And I see a question here from Pilot Projects. They asked, we've been hearing a lot about net zero and natural solutions as an answer to the climate crisis. What is the point of view of Indigenous climate action on this?
So they're being coined as nature-based solutions, working with nature to find the solutions to the climate crisis. Now, it sounds really lovely, but they're actually trying to find ways to commodify or put a price on nature and what its value is in helping us to get to net zero or offset. So this is creating new markets for banks and corporations to invest in to make money. And that's where we are seeing some real dangers in these conversations. So nature-based solutions are actually the co-optation of the Indigenous peoples' movements within the UN climate negotiations for the last 27, 28, 30 years. We have been saying we need to listen to nature, we need to listen to Mother Earth, we need to be in relationship with, but they have actually removed the relationship part, and they've said, let's look at how nature has solutions and how we can put a price on that. And so when we have that price tag on it, it gives corporations and countries the ability to buy it, to own it, further taking more and more Indigenous lands and territories out of our hands and put into market systems, as opposed to allowing us to return to those relationships so that we can move forward in harmony with the natural world, as opposed to looking for ways to buy and trade it.
And I see a question here from Sam Goen. They asked, how can we support our sisters and brothers if we can't go to the communities that are frontline protectors?
There are lots of different ways you can do that. We live in a capitalist system still, so donating to frontline resistance movements is a really good way of doing that. Amplifying, having discussions like this to bring these things to the forefront, and really just sort of amplifying the messages that come through, because, Canada, so-called Canada, has done a really good job of trying to invisibilize Indigenous peoples and the issues that we bring forward. But again, frontline land defenders, I'm going to say this again, Indigenous frontline land defense has resulted in 1.8 billion tons of carbon being left in the ground. And we documented this in a report called Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon. And you can see all of those frontline movements. This is not just about standing on the protest line for nothing. This is about climate justice. And so any way that we can support those frontline movements through amplification, social media, donation, holding a discussion in your community, that's what we need. And it also means decolonizing those policies and telling governments they need to respect the sovereignty and self-determination, not just the band council and colonial government approved voices, but all Indigenous voices.
And I'm not seeing any new questions, but if I've missed any of your questions, please post them again. But I guess before we sign off, do you have any last words for our audience, Eriel, of what you'd want them to know about Indigenous Climate Action's work and sort of what your group has been doing here at COP26?
I think for Indigenous Climate Action, it's important for us it was important for us to bring a delegation to Glasgow to the COP26 because we are in a precarious time of a global pandemic and a growing climate crisis. And yet back home in our communities, we are feeling the brunt of the worst impacts of climate change in many of our communities, and they're completely unaware of how these negotiations are going to impact them. So for us, bringing youth from across the country, letting them understand how these systems work and what kind of levers are being created so that they can take those things back home was really important. It's not just about what happens in these dialogues, but how we can take that back home. And that's where the real work starts, because it's a part of decolonizing our minds, decolonizing our systems, and recognizing that the root causes of climate change are colonialism, capitalism, extractivism, and systems of white supremacy. And when we can fight those systems together, and when we can come forward with new ideologies, we're going to come up with the solutions that we so desperately need.
Great. So thank you so much, Eriel, for joining us today. And thank you to our audience for sending all of your questions. We will leave it there. And you can find all of our coverage at CBCNews.ca. So bye, everyone.
Take care. Thanks.